So I watched Goblin Slayer just recently because, the second season of Goblin Slayer is airing this season and I haven't watched the first season, so I thought to watch the first season and then right after continue to follow the second season in this season. And like many people, I was caught off guard by the unexpected gory scene in the first episode. I'm like, okay, so this is Goblin Slayer, this is what we're dealing with, this is what I'm gonna watch for the next 11 episodes. I'm like, okay, we can work with this, definitely, we can work with this. And I've heard because of this, the show had a lot of controversies, which is, definitely understandable. If you guys aren't good with such heavy visuals, that's definitely fine, but I had no problems with it. And rather, I enjoyed it more because it was brutal. But because it was so brutal, it got me thinking, did I just enjoy Goblin Slayer because of the gory, or is the show actually good? In other words, excluding the gory, what was so good about Goblin Slayer that made me enjoy the show? This is basically what this video is about. Just me trying to rant on why I find Goblin Slayer so good, other than the gory. First, I want to talk about the production quality. I think we all could agree that without a good overall production quality, the gory wouldn't work. Without an art style that doesn't accommodate the gory wouldn't work. The fact that we could feel the brutality and the gruesomeness of the scenes, whether we are excited or disgusted by it, proves that the show has a good production quality. The design of the goblins, the animation on the characters' faces, the voice acting of the screaming characters, the sound effects of the bones breaking, the voices of the goblins, especially the sound effects and the voices. I think this scene in the first episode shows how important sound effects actually are, at least more than what people give them credit for. Arguably, it even played a bigger role than the actual visual animations themselves. Nevertheless though, without all these production-weighted aspects, I'm sure the gory wouldn't be as effective as it was. And not only during the massacre scenes, but directly after when Goblin Slayer showed up. His appearance had such epic and boss vibes, and to create such a vibe, I believe you need proper, good production quality, epic music, epic visuals, epic sound effects. Outside of the action scenes, there isn't much to talk about. The animation is pretty standard, it's good, it isn't bad, it's good, it's okay, it's not like a masterpiece style, but it's good, not much problems with it. The real highlight of the animations is during the fight scenes and during anything goblin related. I know the production quality is like, I associate it with the gory scenes, but it's technically not the gory itself. It's something that made the gory good, so that's technically one reason why I enjoyed the show other than the gory. And for the second reason, I would credit it to the characters. Before I even saw the gory scenes right from the very beginning of the show, something else caught my attention. It's the priestess. I loved her design right from the moment I saw her, and I'm kinda in the show only for her and a few other characters. Her clothes have a really nice palette of white, blue, and green, which continues on to the color of her hair and her eyes, and then even continues on to her staff. I really like how her colors are just so consistent and uniform throughout her entire design, which also fittingly matches her role as a priestess and her innocent character. And then Yui Ogura gives her a nice, gentle, soft voice, which further complements her character. Then we have the Goblin Slayer himself, whose design is not exactly extraordinary. It's overall a pretty standard look for a warrior slash a knight. This like heavily clothed and metallic grey clothing character. The main distinguishing feature of his design is his headgear, which actually I'm not exactly a big fan of because I just don't like the shape of his headgear. But it isn't a big problem for his design. I'm sure that the unique shape of his headpiece is important to give him a memorable design. Important to give him I can't English right now. Okay, once again. But it isn't a big problem for his design because I'm sure that the unique head shape of his headpiece is important to give him a memorable design. Take away the headpiece and it's like it can be any warrior character. Put the head back on and oh, it's the Goblin Slayer. Despite his design not particularly standing out to me, he was just presented in a really visually cool way. The music when he comes in and just his dominating presence. I love his stoic, emotionless, reserved, and non-talkative personality, and he never breaks his character, which is actually amazing, not even for a bit of humor. It's interesting simply to see how he will interact with the other characters, because like the other characters are mostly energetic and at times playful, but then everything with the Goblin Slayer is just so serious and goblin obsessed. He's so focused and oriented in killing goblins, and I like this kind of focused character. I like to follow this kind of main character, this focused type. But because he's so focused on killing goblins, he has my respect. Because at the last arc of the first season, he was willing to ask for help, even selling himself so that he could kill the goblins and protect his village. Also props to his voice actor who did a great job giving his voice that definitely matches his character. Another character who I would like to mention is the Sword Maiden. Although the only thing I want to talk about her is just that I find her design absolutely sick. Nothing about her personality or background or, that arc about her, but just her design. Like, wow, she has such an absolutely cool design. I really want to own a figure of her. I mean, imagine a figure of the Sword Maiden on your cupboard or on your desk or on whatever. Or maybe even a life-size statue. That's pretty cool, I mean. Her design is somewhat similar to the priestess. Maybe she's kinda like a future of the priestess. Maybe like we're doing some Fate Stay Night thing. Her design is pretty similar to the priestess. Maybe that's why I like it. I think it's the white clothes and the golden hair combination. I just love it. But sadly, that's the only thing I want to talk about for the characters. The rest of the characters are okay. They didn't really stood out much to me, which I'll admit is a slight minus point. Not only that their looks are somewhat weak, but we didn't go into them and their background, like characters such as the Lancer, the Heavy Warrior, the Hero, the Female Knight, the Witch. Okay, I didn't have a problem with the fact that the characters don't have actual names, but it's getting annoying when I have to mention them in my video and simply calling them things like the Witch, the Elf, the Dwarf. They're making me sound unprofessional and like having bad English, just calling things by their looks and not by their names. The horse girl, the guild girl, the girl with the big... Have you ever seen another anime about a man who hunts goblins as his life's goal? No, you haven't. We've seen revenge stories against demons, monsters, kaiju, spirits, but goblins? These guys?
And if you ever steal my lunch money again, I'll kick you 3 villages over!
I generally love revenge stories, especially when the background for the cause of the wrath was severe and intense, and I love it even more when the characters are just so passionate with their quest for vengeance. Currently, we are simply following the Goblin Slayer going on different goblin missions, but it was still entertaining to see the entire strategy behind how he kills the goblins. I know it's not something I'm gonna be doing in real life, but it still made me somehow feel like I'm learning how to kill goblins. It's like, wow, what he's saying actually makes sense. I know I'm not the only one who has this opinion, but fight scenes become much more exciting when there is some strategizing to it and the characters are trying to outsmart the enemies instead of a simple straight out fight of strength. We also have a bit of mystery that might signify a larger, more significant problem. I think it was about the Demon Lord or something, maybe also with the goblins on the moon issue. So those are some things to still be excited for in terms of the story. I'm also really glad that the show didn't turn into a power fantasy of the Goblin Slayer easily slaughtering the goblins. It's good that the Goblin Slayer, who was already an expert in slaying goblins, continued to struggle against them and is not all powerful like in other fantasy anime. I just watched Goblin Slayer recently, so maybe back then, around the time when the show aired, it wasn't as bad. But these days, a fantasy anime that is not all about the power flex is already pretty promising. I'm not saying those power fantasy anime are bad, if you like them, okay, you have bad taste. An important theme of the anime is how goblins are actually more severe than people think. We saw this theme very prominently shown to the entire first season. But if we extrapolate this theme further, it is a representation of the weakness of humans, specifically our tendency to underestimate the more insignificant problems around us and how we overestimate ourselves relative to those small problems. Both beginner and veteran adventurers overestimated themselves and underestimated the goblins, and that led to them... Well, for some, it led to their death, and for others, let's just say some difficulties. It's kind of symbolic to how humans underestimate the small things around us and how we have the tendency to overestimate ourselves and, as a consequence, leading to us having problems in the future. It is mentioned through the stories, but it isn't the story itself, it is the message from the story, so it's technically its own point. The theme is somewhat related to gore because to better show how we overestimate ourselves, we have to show the consequence as an extreme consequence. We have to show like extreme pain and extreme gory, extreme violence as a consequence of the overestimation. The theme can definitely still work on its own, but the gory enhances it and made it more clear and more impactful than if it were to be without the gory. Another important theme of the show is the realism. Well, it's technically not a theme, it's more of the direction of the show, but whatever. How is it realistic, you ask? Well, because if adventuring and hunting is a real thing, it would probably look something to what the Goblin Slayer anime shows. A lot of other anime and in other pieces of fantasy, they show adventuring to be something light. You kill the creatures, the lower leveled ones are pretty easy to kill, the animals drop items, we get experience points, we get better gear and whatnot. But in reality, it is like in a Goblin Slayer. How disgusting it is when we kill other creatures, the danger in fighting them, the complicated tactics we have to implement to defeat them, the risk of losing our items, the limitation of our spells, and as mentioned, even the difficulty for beginners to even defeat lower ranked creatures. They are all portrayals of what would happen if adventure fantasy was real. It might be violent, it might be gross, but if you think about it, reality would look something like that, or at least something in that direction. Not a lot of shows follow this realistic approach, so it's definitely interesting to see something with this style. In short, the show is an adventure fantasy with some realism spice, which as a result becomes dark. Moving on to another point, why I think the show is good, is character development. To be honest though, the character development isn't something that specifically made me like the show, but it is a good quality because changes keep the show dynamic and running. So, it's worth a mention. I mean, everyone who watched the show noticed the developments of the characters, and I don't think there's anything particularly deep to talk about regarding the character development, so I'll keep it brief. In the beginning, the priestess was soft and more gentle. The slight look of Gory would paralyze her, and the only spell she knew was a heal spell. But as she continued to work with the Goblin Slayer, she gets used to the violence and even learns a physical spell that she used to slay the goblins in very brutal manners. Then there's also the Goblin Slayer. From an aloof, unsocial character, he became. What did he become? He's still aloof and unsocial, but at least he's more willing to cooperate with others. I think that's the change that happened with the Goblins here. I think it's because he was simply traumatized by his past experience that he preferred to work alone, to avoid any casualties. But as he worked with more and more characters, he opened up to them, and even at the end, he was even willing to ask for their help. As I've said, nothing much or nothing major to talk about. Maybe it simply wasn't strongly emphasized or focused on, but yeah, I had to mention it at least. I enjoyed the show, but it's definitely not perfect. It's not my favorite fantasy, and it might not be my favorite dark fantasy, but I enjoyed it. But there's one weakness of the show that I have to mention. It's the world building. And I've heard criticisms about it which I have to agree on. The good thing about the show is that there's a decent amount of side characters, and they are pretty interesting. The bad thing is, they weren't given much focus. In Season 1, we only saw Goblin slaying and the background of the Goblin Slayer. We didn't even get to see the backstories of the other characters like the elf or the dwarf or the lizardman and how they came together. They could have also explored the other adventures like the witch and her partner, and there's also the heroes, especially the heroes and them killing the demon lord. We completely missed out on that, and that seemed really interesting. There's a solid amount of characters, but none of them were given their own focus other than Goblin Slayer and the priestess. There's the potential for that, but it wasn't there in the first season. To their defense, it was still the first season. I haven't watched the second season, so maybe they are already doing that. But not only that though, if they were to sidetrack on other characters, there is a risk of losing the essence of the show, which is the severity of the goblins. Let's say we focus on a witch girl. She might not have any relation to goblins, so that we aren't gonna revolve around goblins anymore, and that's straying away from the core of the show. The only solution to this is to have all the side characters have a relation or have experiences with goblins. Like if I'm not mistaken, the heroes. I think they have some relation with goblins in their background, so if we go into them, the show might still stick to its core theme of goblins. But to have all the characters be related to the goblins just sounds absolutely weird. Like imagine if every single character lived in a village which got raided from goblins. That's completely absurd and unnatural. So the world building is a weak point of the show, but it is somewhat understandable considering the focus is more on the Goblin Slayer, hence the title. But then again, I don't know how long the show can maintain an interesting show if they don't expand the Goblin Slayer world. But then again, for an entire season, they only focused on the Goblin slaying, and I enjoyed it, so then again, who knows? But yeah, back to my original question. Even if there was no gory, if they were standard action scenes, Goblin Slayer still has other things going for them that made the show enjoyable. The characters and their design, the production quality, the themes that they focus on, and the character development. The gory is still important though because, as I've said, the theme of the severity of the goblins is somewhat reliant on it. So I can't say that the gory was useless, like that it was a superficial thing. The gory definitely made the show even more impactful, but it's definitely not the only reason why the show was good. The gory definitely kept me hooked on the show and gave my experience a shock factor, but it's definitely not the only reason why the show was good. But yeah, that's just my thoughts, just me trying to figure out why Goblin Slayer caught my attention so much, other than through the gory. Let me know your thoughts down below. Was the first season of Goblin Slayer only good because of the shock aspect and the gory, or does it actually have other things that made the show good? Or maybe you didn't even enjoy Goblin Slayer. Did I forget to mention other things that made the show interesting? Or maybe I forgot some things that the show did horribly. Feel free to share your thoughts down below. Of course, don't forget to sub for other anime reviews and such, but yeah, thanks for watching.